What if the evening itself could remember? The air above the low hill holds a salt that tastes like sorrow. Below, 5 cities lie quiet beneath centuries of dust, their names drifting between scripture and sand. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, Ekron. Once, they shimmered like small mirrors along the coast. Now, they are murmurs in the twilight. You stand there, where light bends and ancient voices fade, and you wonder, who were they truly? What pulse once beat beneath these ruins? And if they are gone, why does their shadow still follow every page of the sacred text, like a memory that refuses to die? They called themselves people of the coast, though no one now can be certain what tongue they first spoke to the sea. Their story begins not with conquest, but with a question. How does a people vanish, yet remain so vividly feared, named again and again in sacred lines? To read the old texts is to watch a nation shimmer at the edge of memory, never fully known, never fully gone. Between the mountains of Judah and the restless coast lay a strip of gentle valleys, the Shephelah. There, wind from the sea carried both trade and war, and within that narrow breath, the Philistines made their stand. To understand them, one must walk between worlds, the world of belief and the world of stone. The book of Judges begins to whisper of their presence, a shadow pressing against Israel's fragile borders. By the time of Samuel, their chariots clattered across the plains, iron wheels flashing like the eyes of gods. Yet these were not demons, nor legends, but people shaped by geography and hunger. Their fields of barley and vines reached toward the sun. Their walls rose to meet the fear of desert raiders. Their ships slid along the Mediterranean like silver leaves. They lived in the tension between sea and soil, wielding strength drawn from both. They would become the great mirror for Israel, a reflection of what it might become or lose. The scriptures do not describe them kindly, yet they cannot look away. Each encounter between these peoples carries the pulse of something larger than rivalry. It is the ache of identity forming through opposition. Even in enmity, there is recognition. But who were they really? Were they the Peliset of Egyptian carvings, strangers from across the Aegean, or children of the same soil with new gods and sharper weapons? The truth, like the dusk over the hill, is layered. Archaeologists brush away centuries of earth and find fragments that speak in many dialects. Gilded pottery showing patterns known from Crete, bones of pigs feasted upon in ways foreign to highland Israel, city gates built wide for carts, heavy with oil and grain. These are the voices beneath the text, the other eye that watches as we read. To the faithful, the Philistines are the foil, the proud who fell before divine justice. To the historian, they are a thread in the fabric of the late bronze collapse, one ripple in a storm that remade the world. And to the wanderer standing now in the soft gold of the dying sun, they are neither villain nor myth. They are the echo of migration, of cities built and burned, of names forgotten but never erased. Why should this story matter today? Because the land remembers even when the language changes. The same plains where Samson once stood are now crossed by highways and olive trucks. But beneath them, the soil still breathes the memory of fire and faith. To look at that horizon is to sense that no culture truly disappears. It only changes shape, waiting for someone to listen again. The evening deepens. The 5 cities fade into silhouettes. You realize the journey ahead is not to resurrect them, but to learn how history dreams, how the ghosts of nations continue to move beneath the surface of time. Whispering through the stones we still walk upon, to read the ancient world is to look through 2 eyes, one fixed on the written word, the other on the silent ground. Scripture offers rhythm and purpose. Archaeology offers fragments, unaligned, but breathing. Between them lies a narrow passage where truth flickers like light underwater. The story of the Philistines must be walked with both eyes open, or else it dissolves into fable or dust. One eye turns to the text, the book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the chronicles of kings and prophets. There, the Philistines rise and fall like waves, their names tangled with Israel's most intimate struggles. They are the storm that forces faith to find its spine. Yet the other eye, the one of earth and evidence, refuses to accept them as only symbols. It sees the baked clay of walls, the crushed shells in mortar, the faint scent of oil soaked into ancient floors. These remnants have no creed, yet they speak in the language of endurance. In the ruins of Ashkelon, archaeologists uncovered streets paved with broken amphorae, shards from distant islands. Gath revealed massive city gates wide enough for chariots, a threshold meant for processions or war. At Ekron, a vast network of oil presses lay like a sleeping machine, its channels still carrying the ghosts of olive pulp. Each discovery draws a line through time, linking the text's tension to the steady hum of daily life. Commerce, craftsmanship, and the stubborn will to survive. The method is not faith against science. It is the act of holding both until they tremble together. The ancient Egyptians recorded the Peliset, enemies from across the sea who came with fire and iron. The Assyrians later wrote of cities bearing those same names, now bound under tribute, and the Babylonians, who ended the last Philistine kingships, left only lists, grain, taxes, prisoners. Between these bureaucratic breaths lies the life of a people once loud, now translated into numbers. To trace them is to follow shadows through layered soil. Radiocarbon clocks whisper of settlements blooming after the late Bronze collapse, around the 13th century before our reckoning. Pottery analysis confirms a mingling of styles, Aegean curves meeting Canaanite pragmatism. Even the diet tells a story. The bones of pigs and cattle in coastal sites outnumber those in Israelite highlands, hinting at traditions that cross the sea yet bent toward the local earth. Language, too, changes under the weight of belonging. Fragments of inscriptions, written in early alphabetic forms, evolved towards Semitic script within 2 centuries, as if the newcomers were learning to dream in a new tongue. Such evidence does not shout, it murmurs. To hear it requires stillness. For every artifact unearthed, there are 10 swallowed forever. The Philistines, like all who live close to the sea, understood impermanence. They built with pride, yet their walls were never meant to last beyond memory's tide. What remains are traces that need interpretation, and faith, though of another kind. Imagine a scholar kneeling beside a ruined gate, her brush moving like a heartbeat, dust rising in the low light. Beneath her hands, a line of burnt stone testifies to something unspeakable, perhaps conquest, perhaps accident. Behind her, a pastor reads from Samuel, the verses trembling with the same wind. Neither sees the full picture, yet together they approach something closer to truth, the world as it was, and the world as we remember it. So the path through this story must be double. One step through scripture, one through soil, one in the realm of spirit, one in the quiet hum of carbon and clay. Only when both eyes are open can the past begin to breathe again, not as a lesson, not as proof, but as presence. The Philistines do not return to life. Rather, we draw near to their echo, to the way they shaped the very words we still whisper in prayer and in study. And as dusk folds over the coastal plain, you feel that peculiar calm that comes before revelation. The sense that beneath every verse, beneath every stone, something ancient waits, patient as the tide, ready to speak when both eyes are finally awake. Hidden beneath centuries of sand and silence lies the question that will not rest. Where did the Philistines come from? The old records offer fragments, never a face. Egyptian reliefs carved in the time of Ramesses III speak of invaders from across the sea, the Peliset, their ships adorned with bird-like prows, their warriors marching with feathered crests. Around the 12th century before our counting, the Mediterranean trembled with migrations, and empires once thought eternal began to crumble. The world's edges were shifting. It is in this twilight that the Philistines seem to rise, not as conquerors alone, but as survivors of a larger collapse. Most scholars trace them to the great convulsion of the late Bronze Age. Cities along the Aegean had fallen, trade routes fractured, and desperate fleets wandered in search of new shores. The coast of Canaan, fertile and strategic, drew them like light draws moths. Here they found a strip of land open yet contested, hemmed between the highlands of Israel and the ambitions of Egypt. But to speak of a single origin is to miss the rhythm of migration. They came not as one tribe, but as a storm of languages, crafts, and gods. Some carried Aegean pottery styles, others Levantine weapons. Together they forged a new identity upon foreign soil. Archaeologists, brushing away dust from Ashdod and Ekron, have found vessels painted in the Aegean manner, swirling red and black, echoes of Crete and Mycenae, yet shaped with the hands of local clay workers. It is not imitation, but blending. In early layers, bones of pigs appear in abundance, a custom alien to the Semitic highlands, suggesting newcomers who kept their own feasts. Over time, the numbers thin, customs bend, the scent of the sea fades into the dust of Canaan. Cultures, after all, do not die with violence alone. They dissolve through the intimacy of daily life. Still, not all agree. Some voices in the quiet halls of academia question the sea-born exodus. They argue that the so-called sea peoples were not foreign at all, but coastal Canaanites reborn under new pressures, their crafts inspired by trade rather than invasion. Genetic analyses of skeletons from Ashkelon reveal a blend. Early generations carry strands linked to southern Europe, but within a century, those traces nearly vanish, replaced by local lineages. What begins as a journey across the sea becomes a story of absorption, of strangers turning native. The very idea of the Philistine may thus be less a people than a moment, a meeting of tides that soon receded. Yet the name persisted, passed through Egyptian decrees, Assyrian annals, and Hebrew verses. To Egypt, they were a warning of chaos subdued. To Israel, they were the face of opposition sanctified by faith. To Assyria and Babylon, they were merely tributaries along the road to empire. Each record reshaped them, until history itself could no longer find their true outline. In this fog of names and shards, one truth gleams faintly. The Philistines were children of transition. They lived in a time when borders cracked and belief had to rebuild itself from ash. Their arrival marks the first beat of the Iron Age, when the tools of survival hardened into weapons, and the gods of old were questioned by every flame that rose from a ruined town. To imagine them is to stand at the shore of history and watch the sea deposit fragments of a civilization both lost and found. And perhaps that is why their story still stirs unease. For within their migrations we glimpse our own, how identity drifts, how memory attaches itself to new soil, how strangers become natives by the slow grace of forgetting. The wind over the ruins of Gaza still carries the breath of that transformation, whispering through the broken gates. Every people begins as someone else's rumour. When night falls on the Shephelah, the stars over the coast seem older than the land itself. The same constellations that guided those early ships now glimmer over highways and settlements. If one listens long enough, one can almost hear the rhythm of oars and the hush of new beginnings, the eternal sound of arrival that has always been the first line of every human story. Along the southern coast of ancient Canaan, the land rose and fell in gentle waves of limestone and sand. There, 5 cities formed like pearls along a single string: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron. Together they were known as the Pentapolis, 5 reflections of one restless soul. Each city ruled itself, yet all were bound by a delicate thread of kinship and defense. It was not a kingdom in the way of Egypt or Assyria, but something subtler, a league of autonomy, fragile as sea foam, enduring as tide. In Gaza, caravans from Arabia met ships from the west. The city pulsed with movement, the clang of metal, the scent of spices, the shouts of merchants arguing in tongues from across the world. Ashkelon looked seaward, her walls kissed by salt and wind, her markets rich with oil and grain. Ashdod, older and inland, stood watch over the road that cut toward the hills of Judah. Gath was the fortress of warriors, stone bastions and open courtyards where chariots gleamed. Ekron, quiet and industrious, became the heartbeat of their economy, the workshop where olive oil flowed like sunlight caught in clay. Each city bore the mark of its own deity and custom. Their leaders, the Serenim, were lords of both trade and battle, drawn together when danger approached, then scattering again into rivalry. It was a structure born from the sea itself, fluid, shifting, hard to conquer, harder to define. Beneath their competition ran the understanding that survival along this coast required cooperation. When the winds of empire began to rise, that understanding would be tested again and again. To walk through their streets now, if time allowed it, would be to hear a symphony of hands, artisans at the wheel, potters shaping vessels adorned with spirals borrowed from the Aegean, masons carving reliefs of fish and grain, women weaving bright garments dyed with the hues of murex shells. Smoke rose from kilns and hearths. Children played where merchants once weighed silver and barley. The sound of iron echoed from the forges, an early mastery that would make the Philistines both envied and feared. Ekron, in particular, left behind a strange legacy: the vast olive oil industry, uncovered by archaeologists, stretching across the ruins like a mechanical forest, channels cut into limestone, vats for pressing, drainage for liquid gold. It was as if the city itself breathed oil. Inscriptions found nearby speak of a king, Ashish son of Padi, who offered tribute to Assyria, a reminder that even prosperity required submission. The presses fell silent centuries ago, yet the stones still glistened faintly, as if remembering the warmth of sunlit harvests. The Philistine League, though united in language and trade, was never free from tension. Ambition smouldered between the cities. Gaza envied Gath's soldiers. Gath envied Ekron's wealth. Yet, when the highlands threatened, or Egypt's chariots advanced along the coast, they moved as one body, 5 hearts beating under a single armour of fear. Theirs was a pragmatism born of proximity. To live between empires, one must learn the art of bending without breaking. Beneath the grandeur of temples and gates, life followed quieter rhythms. Farmers tilled the valleys, fishermen cast nets from reed boats, women lit lamps before dusk, and prayed to gods whose names are now forgotten. On festival nights, drums echoed against city walls, and fires reflected in the bronze of helmets stacked beside the altars. Trade, worship, war, all merged into one seamless song of survival. It is tempting to see in the Pentapolis the seeds of a forgotten order, a civilization balancing between freedom and submission, individuality and alliance. Yet perhaps their greatest strength was also their doom. When Assyrian and Babylonian armies came, the 5 cities could not hold each other long enough. The same autonomy that once made them adaptable became the crack through which destiny entered. Still, in their prime, the 5 cities were luminous. From the hilltop at sunset, they must have glowed like constellations scattered across the earth, each with its own pulse, its own prayer. Together, they formed the beating heart of Philistia, a place where sea and soil met, where ambition burned, and where the story of a vanished people left its clearest imprint upon the world. Even now, when the wind passes over the coastal plains, it seems to carry the breath of those ancient towns, the whisper of markets and chariots, the laughter of sailors watching the horizon. 5 cities, 5 lives, one memory suspended forever between the tide and the stars. If one listens closely to the ruins of those 5 cities, one can almost hear the pulse of their daily life, the mingling of sea salt, iron, and prayer. The Philistine world was not merely a network of walls and workshops. It was a living mosaic, where cultures melted into one another until the edges blurred. To look within their society is to see the reflection of a people forever balancing between inheritance and invention. At the top stood the warrior merchants, men whose hands bore both sword and seal. They ruled from courtyards shaded by pillars of limestone, their ledgers and weapons kept side by side. Beneath them stretched layers of artisans and traders, smiths, weavers, potters, shipbuilders, brewers, each bound to the rhythms of tribute and tax. The farmers worked the lower plains, tending barley and vines under the hum of cicadas. Slaves and labourers hauled stone or oil, the unseen spine of the Philistine machine. It was a society as practical as it was proud, organised not by ideals, but by the necessity of endurance. Trade stitched their world together. The harbours of Ashkelon and Gaza drew ships from Cyprus, Crete, and the Delta. Amphorae arrived filled with wine and perfume, and departed heavy with oil and grain. Markets rang with languages no longer spoken. Aegean tongues twisting into early Semitic forms, merchants haggling over tin, lapis, and linen. To walk those streets would be to feel the hum of the ancient Mediterranean, a sea not of distance but of proximity, where every shore touched another. Religion too bore the signature of mingling. The Philistines raised temples to Dagon, god of grain and fertility, though his name and nature were borrowed from older Western Semitic traditions. In Ashdod, his shrine rose tall above the city, a blend of foreign and local architecture, columns carved in island style, inner chambers arranged as in Canaanite sanctuaries. Alongside Dagon stood other deities, Astarte, Baal, perhaps even imported gods whose names dissolved before reaching us. Their worship was not pure, but layered. Offerings of grain and oil, libations poured over carved altars, chants that mixed dialects like tides mixing salt. And yet, beneath this complexity, the Philistines were slowly changing. The children of migrants became natives, the coastal tongue, once echoing with Aegean cadence, bent toward the Semitic speech of their neighbours. Clay tablets and ostraca reveal a shift toward alphabetic script. The written word itself evolved, adapting to the languages of Canaan. A people who once arrived as outsiders were now indistinguishable from those they had displaced. This was not conquest. It was transformation. Archaeologists have found small tokens of this blending. Household idols of local make beside imported pottery, cooking pots that mix foreign and native shapes, jewellery etched with hybrid symbols of land and sea. Even their architecture learned to bend. Flat-roofed houses adapted to the Levantine sun, courtyards open to catch the inland breeze. Their cuisine changed, their rituals softened. It was as if the land itself was teaching them its customs, reshaping their very sense of belonging. Still, something restless endured. The Philistines remained a people of thresholds, never entirely at home on either side of the horizon. Their identity, forged from fragments, carried both strength and fragility. They knew the language of trade better than the language of blood. They believed in prosperity more than permanence. And perhaps this is why the prophets would later see in them a warning, how power without roots becomes smoke before the wind. But in their own time, they thrived. The plains around Ekron glowed each autumn with the shimmer of ripening olives. Fishermen dragged nets heavy with silver scales, while caravans moved north and south along the coastal highway, bearing goods toward Tyre and Egypt. In the evenings, the cities filled with music, the low hum of lyres, the rhythm of feet in dust, the laughter of merchants who believed the sea would always return their ships. If history is a mirror, the Philistines reflect a moment when civilization itself was learning to rebuild after collapse. Their hybrid world was both a wound and a cure. Proof that survival often requires surrendering what once seemed unchangeable. Beneath the calm of their temples and the order of their markets, the tide of assimilation was already rising. They did not see it then. But the same openness that gave them life would one day erase their name. For now, though, the coast belonged to them. From Gaza's gates to Ashkelon's cliffs, the night carried the scent of oil and smoke, of labour and prayer. The stars leaned low over their rooftops, watching a people who had turned survival into art, unaware that they were already fading into the very soil that sustained them. There are moments in history when a people's power seems almost elemental, drawn not from empire or prophecy, but from the land beneath their feet. For the Philistines, strength came from three pillars, each invisible yet unshakable: the soil, the crossroads, and the craft of their hands. Together, these formed a trinity of endurance, binding their fate to the rhythms of the earth itself. First was the land, the low plains of Philistia, fertile and patient, washed by sea winds and fed by seasonal rains. Wheat and barley swayed in unbroken fields, olives shimmered in silver rows, vines crept over terraces like veins of green fire. The soil was gentle to those who tended it, cruel to those who neglected its seasons. In these valleys, abundance was not luxury but defense. A city with full granaries could survive a siege longer than faith alone. From this quiet wealth rose confidence, and from confidence, pride. They believed their gods had blessed them, though perhaps it was the earth itself that had made them bold. The second pillar was place. The Philistine coast was no frontier. It was a heartbeat between worlds. Caravans from the desert met ships from the islands. Soldiers marching from Egypt crossed paths with merchants bound for Mesopotamia. Whoever held these plains controlled the arteries of ancient commerce. Along the Great Trunk Road, tolls and tributes filled their treasuries. Their ports became the mouths through which the riches of the East met the hunger of the West. Geography became destiny, and so their 5 cities stood like guardians of a gate, both coveted and cursed by their location. The third pillar was iron, the secret that darkened their hands and changed the world. Long before their rivals in the hills, the Philistines learned to tame the black metal hidden in the earth. From smoky forges came blades that did not bend, plowshares that did not break. Iron was the breath of their strength and the sound of their ambition. In the heat of their furnaces, they found not only tools but a language of dominance. The clang of hammer on anvil echoed through the valleys, a rhythm that both built and destroyed. These 3 elements, earth, road, and forge, made the Philistines formidable. Yet in every strength lies its opposite. Fertile land invites envy. Crossroads invite invasion. The mastery of iron awakens fear. Their neighbours in the highlands, still bound to bronze, saw in them an unsettling advantage. The scriptures would later clothe this anxiety in legend, painting the Philistines as giants, descendants of some ancient breed, tall and terrible. Goliath of Gath, his spear described as a weaver's beam, stands in memory not as a man but as a metaphor. The giants were never proven by bone or ruin. Their presence belongs to the symbolic realm, the language of awe and defiance. To Israel, hemmed by threat and doubt, the Philistines appeared larger than life because their power was tangible and immediate. Goliath's size, whether literal or imagined, was the physical shape of imbalance, the terror of facing those who had what you lacked: technology, strategy, certainty. In this way, the legend holds a truth deeper than measurement. It reveals how strength distorts perspective, how fear makes shadows taller than men. The Philistines themselves would have smiled at such myths. For them, the world was practical. They trusted the solidity of walls, the sharpness of iron, the abundance of oil. Their gods were transactional, their rituals precise. In the evening, as the sea dimmed and the fields cooled, they would offer grain and incense to Dagon and Astarte, seeking balance between blessing and consequence. Each flame that rose from an altar was a contract, each prayer a negotiation. And yet, as their prosperity deepened, another kind of weakness began to bloom: the slow complacency of certainty. They built stronger gates, but left open the door of arrogance. They believed iron would always obey their command, that trade would never falter, that the soil would never grow tired. History, however, is rarely kind to those who mistake advantage for immortality. When the first tremors of Assyrian ambition reached the coast, the Philistines stood behind their iron and their wealth, confident that geography and craftsmanship would protect them. But the same roads that had once carried caravans now carried armies. The same fields that had nourished them would soon feed their conquerors. For now, though, they still glowed with power. Their cities shimmered beneath the stars like embers that refused to die. To walk their plains at night was to feel the hum of iron beneath the soil, to smell the sweetness of olive and smoke, to sense a people convinced they could outlast time itself. And somewhere in the dark, a whisper, the sound of pride turning slowly toward its consequence. Between the highlands of Judah and the restless sea lies a stretch of undulating earth, the Shephelah, the low country. It is neither mountain nor coast, but the breadth between them, a land of olive groves and winding valleys where sunlight settles like dust. To those who seek to understand the wars of ancient Israel, this landscape is more than geography. It is motive. It is fate. For whoever holds these valleys holds the arteries of the land, the passes that lead from the interior to the ports, the lifelines of grain, wine, and tribute. The Shephelah was the quiet heart of conflict, the place where the ambitions of the Philistines met the prayers of Israel. Here, history unfolded, not in palaces, but in the narrow corridors of the earth. The valleys of Sorek, Aegean, and Elah each carry memories steeped in both scripture and soil. In the valley of Sorek, a man named Samson once wandered in fury and desire. In Aegean, chariots thundered beneath a sky that refused to darken. And in Elah, a shepherd faced a giant, and the sound of a stone in flight became the sound of destiny. The Philistines understood the Shephelah as lifeblood. Their chariots, swift on the flat terrain, gave them mastery where the hillsmen faltered. Iron wheels cut grooves into the dust. The echo of hooves carried messages faster than any prophet's word. They built outposts along the ridges, garrisons where soldiers could see both mountain and sea, their watchfires blinking like small suns in the twilight. To them, the valleys were not borders but bridges, gateways to Jerusalem's heart and to the trade routes beyond. To Israel, the same valleys were wounds. From the heights, they looked down upon the Philistine advance and saw not merely armies, but inevitability. The lowlands offered no protection, only exposure. Every invasion followed the same breath of wind from the west. Every deliverance, the same return uphill. Thus, the Shephelah became the stage on which faith itself was tested. For how does one defend open ground with nothing but belief? Archaeology paints this tension with quiet precision. In the sediment of Elah lie slingstones, fragments of pottery, traces of encampments. They tell of repeated clashes over centuries, each leaving little but broken clay and ashes. In the ruins of Gath, massive walls rise still from the soil, a monument to both fear and pride. Their gates faced eastward, toward the hills, toward Israel, as if the city never stopped watching. It is easy to imagine the Shephelah by sound rather than sight. The sigh of wind through low grass, the creak of chariot axles, the murmur of shepherds calling their flocks under the same sun that glinted off spearheads. Every step here was contested, every breath borrowed, and yet, in the spaces between battle, life went on. Farmers sowed seed, children played in the dust, women filled jars at wells where soldiers had once fallen. The earth, indifferent, covered everything alike. Control of the Shephelah meant more than victory. It meant access. The valley roads linked Egypt's empire with the kingdoms of the north, carrying both wealth and war. To command them was to command time itself, to dictate who moved and who waited. This is why the Philistines built fortresses so close to Israel's borders, and why Israel's kings, from Saul to David, fought desperately to push them back. The valleys were the lungs of the land. Whoever possessed them could breathe. Yet, there is another layer to this geography, spiritual as much as strategic. The Shephelah is not merely contested soil, it is the middle ground of the soul, the space between faith and fear, pride and surrender. To walk it is to understand that every conflict, ancient or modern, begins in such in-between places. Perhaps that is why the scriptures linger here, returning again and again to these valleys. They are reminders that history does not unfold on mountaintops of certainty, but in the quiet plains where choices are made and unmade beneath the indifferent gaze of the sky. When dusk falls over the Shephelah, the air grows heavy with memory. The outlines of ancient roads fade into shadow, and for a moment the land seems to exhale, relieved of its burden of conquest. In the stillness, one can almost hear the echo of distant wheels, the faint ring of iron, and beneath it all, the slow heartbeat of a valley that has seen too much, yet endures, patient as time itself. Long before kings ruled from Jerusalem, when judges still rose and fell like tides of faith, the valleys of the Shephelah became a theatre of defiance. The book of Judges tells of cycles that repeat like the seasons: sin, oppression, repentance, deliverance. And within that pattern burns the fierce tragic light of Samson. His story unfolds in fragments of strength and weakness, a riddle carved into flesh, the echo of a people trying to remember what freedom feels like. Samson's world was one overshadowed by the Philistines. Around the late 12th century, before the Common Reckoning, their garrisons dotted the plains. Their chariots cut through the roads that once belonged to Israel's tribes. The Israelites, weary and leaderless, farmed the soil but paid tribute in fear. It was not only military domination, it was spiritual exhaustion. Their God seemed distant, their stories dimmed. Into this silence was born a man who embodied contradiction, a deliverer who could not deliver himself. Samson's strength is legend, but his loneliness is truer. He walked the valleys of Sorek and Timnah, lands humming with Philistine songs and festivals. His heart was drawn not to battle, but to beauty. His eyes turned toward the women of the enemy. The scriptures whisper of his anger, his riddles, his vengeance, yet beneath them lies something quieter, a yearning to belong somewhere, anywhere, between the two worlds that shaped him. The Philistines feared him not merely for his power, but because he was one of them in part, a mirror of what both peoples shared and denied. The tale of Delilah, so often recited as betrayal, carries deeper tones in the fading light of history. It is the story of seduction, yes, but also of weariness, the exhaustion of perpetual war, the human need to rest even when surrounded by enemies. Samson, a Nazarite sworn to divine purpose, forgets the vow that binds him. His hair, long and heavy, becomes a symbol of both gift and burden. When it is cut, the silence that follows feels not like defeat, but inevitability. His capture, his blindness, his final act of destruction, these are not merely vengeance. They are the collapse of a man who carried too much myth upon his shoulders. Archaeology lends no proof to his existence, yet the world he moved through is real enough. The ruins of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Timnah bear the marks of that age. Philistine pottery layered atop the remains of earlier Canaanite towns, tools of iron, fragments of grain silos, the bones of livestock, all tell of a culture confident and expanding. Against such material strength, one man's rage could do little, yet legend magnifies where history cannot. Samson's life becomes a metaphor for resistance, destructive, futile, necessary. His final moment, chained in the temple of Dagon, calls forth both awe and sorrow. The structure he brings down is more than stone. It is the weight of pride, of vengeance mistaken for redemption. As the pillars crack, as dust fills the air, the boundaries between oppressor and oppressed blur. The God of Israel grants strength once more, but the victory costs everything. In that collapse lies the echo of every human struggle, the desire to prove power to a world that will forget your name. And yet, from that ruin, a seed of renewal. The Philistine dominance was shaken, but not ended. Israel's courage, dimmed, but not extinguished. The valleys fell silent again, filled with the smell of crushed grain and smoke. The people would rise and falter in the same rhythm for generations until the age of judges gave way to the yearning for a king. The story of Samson endures because it refuses simplicity. It is both warning and lament, strength and fragility intertwined. The Philistines emerge from it not as monsters, but as neighbours caught in the same web of divine and human will. To stand where Samson once stood is to feel that tension still, the pull between destiny and desire, faith and flesh. When night gathers over the valley of Sorek, the hills whisper his name like a forgotten prayer. Somewhere among the olive trees, the wind shifts, carrying the faint memory of laughter, the groan of collapsing stone, and the realization that even the strongest among us are only echoes waiting to fade into the quiet rhythm of the earth. The age of judges ebbed like a tide retreating from the shore, leaving behind the scattered relics of tribal rule. By the turn of the 11th century, before the Common Reckoning, Israel's heart longed for order, for a king who could unify their fear into purpose. And beyond the hills, the Philistines watched. Their cities gleamed under the sun. Their chariots cut clean lines through the plains. Their iron blades outshone the bronze weapons of the highlands. The stage was set not merely for war, but for a reckoning between faith and strategy. Saul, the first to wear a crown over Israel, rose from the anonymity of Benjamin to face an enemy already versed in empire. The Philistines were no longer raiders, but administrators. They stationed garrisons deep in the heart of Canaan, at Geba, at Michmash, and along the trade roads that fed the land. From their forges poured swords and spears of iron, tools denied to the Israelites except through Philistine oversight. The text remembers this imbalance with pain. In the day of battle, not a sword nor a spear was found in Israel's hand. Their dependence was complete, their humiliation nearly so. The confrontation came to a head at Aphek, near the western slopes where the air still smells faintly of salt. The Philistines advanced in confidence, bearing the memory of Samson's fall as proof that Israel's God could be mocked and survived. The Israelites, desperate, carried into battle what they believed to be their ultimate weapon, the Ark of the Covenant. They thought, perhaps, that faith could be wielded like a sword. But faith, when confused with superstition, cuts only inward. The Ark was captured. Israel's army scattered. The shock of defeat rippled through the land like a stone dropped into still water. For 7 months, the Ark remained in Philistine hands, moving from Ashdod to Gath, from Gath to Ekron, followed by whispers of plague and terror. The chronicles speak of idols fallen, of afflictions that spread in darkness. Whether these were disease, fear, or coincidence, history will not say. What matters is the recognition that power misused becomes its own undoing. The Philistines, triumphant yet uneasy, sent the sacred object back, carried by oxen along the same roads their armies had marched. It was as though the land itself demanded balance. For Saul, the episode was a wound that never healed. His reign would be marked by flashes of courage and shadows of doubt. Against the Philistines, he waged campaign after campaign, pushing them back, only to watch them return stronger. At Gaza, he struck a blow through his son Jonathan's daring raid. At Michmash, the enemy fell in confusion. Yet each victory came with a warning that faith without patience can turn triumph into tragedy. The Philistines, pragmatic as ever, adapted. Their alliances stretched beyond the sea. Their merchants bartered even with enemies. They understood what Saul did not, that survival was an economy, not a miracle. By the time the Battle of Gilboa arrived, the balance of power had tilted once again. The Philistines advanced from the coast in disciplined ranks, their chariots rolling like thunder through the valley. Israel's army broke upon the slopes. Saul fell upon his own sword, and with him the first experiment of kingship. For the Philistines, the victory at Gilboa was complete. The northern trade routes opened. Their influence spread deep into Israelite territory. But triumph has a strange aftertaste. In their moment of dominance, they inherited the burden of overreach. The Ark's return had already hinted that certain powers were not meant to be held. Within their cities, omens began to stir. Whispers of a shepherd rising from Bethlehem. A new kind of strength unmeasured by iron or numbers. The story of Saul and the Philistines is not merely one of defeat and conquest. It is the meeting of two kinds of blindness, one born of pride, the other of fear. The Philistines, sure of their iron and their gods, saw faith as weakness. Israel, clinging to relics instead of trust, mistook ritual for covenant. Both would learn that the divine cannot be contained by possession. In the silence after Gilboa, the Shephelah lay once more between them, calm and cruel. The same valleys that had witnessed Samson's rage now watched the end of Saul's despair. The wind carried no judgment, only the weary truth that victory and ruin share the same road. And somewhere along that road, a young harpist tended sheep, unaware that his path would soon cross the long shadow of Gath. The story was not finished. The land, as always, was waiting. In the valley of Elah, where the hills open like a wound between Judah and the sea, the story of power turns toward a boy. The time is roughly 10-20 years before our counting, when Saul's crown still gleamed and the Philistines gathered once again along the ridges, their armies stretched across the valley floor. Lines of iron, shields glittering like fish scales beneath the sun. From their ranks stepped a champion of Gath, a figure so immense that even the air seemed to bow around him. His name was Goliath, and with him strode the weight of legend. The texts describe him in impossible dimensions, his spear like a weaver's beam, his armor heavier than a man could bear. Yet beyond the exaggeration lies something truer, the fear of facing an enemy who embodies everything one lacks. The Philistines possessed iron, strategy, discipline. Israel, scattered tribes, and brittle faith. Goliath was not merely a warrior, he was certainty given form, and before such certainty, even kings trembled. From the opposite ridge came David, still smelling of sheep and wilderness. His weapon was not strength but focus, the stillness of one who listens rather than commands. Where Saul sought deliverance through ritual and arms, David sought clarity in silence. When he stepped into the valley, sling in hand, the world seemed to hold its breath. The stone he loosed did more than strike a forehead. It struck at the heart of imbalance, the illusion that power is measured by size or metal. But victory is never the end of the story. After Goliath fell, the lines of war redrew themselves. The Philistines retreated, but not far. Their cities still pulsed with wealth. Their armies still filled the plains. For David, the triumph became a shadow. The songs sung in his honor would soon become weapons against him in Saul's court. Forced into exile, he fled to none other than Gath, the very city that had birthed his fallen foe. History, it seems, has a taste for irony. There, under the uneasy hospitality of King Achish, David lived among the Philistines. He learned their customs, their rhythms of war and trade. He became, for a time, one of them. To the Israelites, he was a traitor. To the Philistines, a curiosity. A Hebrew commander leading his own men, raiding the desert fringes in the name of survival. Yet beneath this ambiguity, something profound was forming. David was learning what Saul never did: to read the currents beneath power, to understand enemies not as monsters, but as mirrors. When at last he ascended the throne of Israel, the wars resumed, but differently. David fought the Philistines not out of hatred, but necessity. Each campaign began, as the text repeats, only after he inquired of his God. The question was always the same: shall I go up? And the answer never identical. There was a rhythm to his obedience, a restraint that set him apart from the kings who would follow. Slowly, through strategy and faith, he broke their hold over the valleys, reclaiming the Shephelah piece by piece until the coastal plains trembled with retreat. Yet the Philistines did not vanish overnight. They adapted, retreating to their fortified ports, trading tribute for survival. In time, David's victories became less about territory and more about understanding the fragile balance of power that bound the region. He ruled with the memory of Gath always before him, a reminder that triumph over an enemy is not conquest, but comprehension. Modern scholars trace the echoes of this struggle through layers of ash and inscription. At Tel Es-Safi, ancient Gath, massive fortifications speak of expansion during this era, walls over 4 meters thick, scarred by fire yet rebuilt. The archaeology suggests not annihilation, but resilience. Even in defeat, the Philistines persisted, adjusting to new rulers and new gods. History, like the sea, rarely ends in one wave. The story of David and Goliath endures because it is more than a battle. It is a meditation on perception. The Philistine giant, though slain, remains alive in every age that mistakes might for meaning. And David, with his sling and his stillness, reminds us that clarity is stronger than armor. But perhaps the deeper truth lies between them. Both were sons of the same earth, both bound to the same valley, both instruments in a larger rhythm that neither could hear in full. As the sun lowers over the Elah today, the wind moves through barley fields where soldiers once stood. The earth remembers the tremor of their steps, but keeps no record of their names. The valley belongs to silence again, the kind that hums between two mountains, holding both victory and grief. Somewhere in that stillness, one can almost hear the echo of a stone striking not flesh, but history itself, reminding the living that every triumph casts a shadow, and that even faith must learn to walk softly upon the ground it redeems. Long after David's wars had quieted, when his son's kingdom glittered with gold and eventually cracked beneath its own weight, the Philistines remained, a coastal hum in the background of Israel's story. The prophets began to speak then, their words rising like wind from the deserts, carrying both warning and lament. They turned their gaze toward the sea and saw in those 5 ancient cities the reflection of a deeper failing, not of one people, but of all who forget that strength is borrowed, not owned. Amos, the shepherd prophet from Tekoa, was among the first to let judgment spill across the map. Around the middle of the 8th century before our reckoning, when Assyria's shadow lengthened over the Levant, he spoke of Gaza and Ashkelon, of Ashdod and Ekron, naming them not as enemies, but as examples. They had trafficked in human lives, he said, delivered entire communities into bondage for silver. The sin was not warfare, it was commerce without conscience. To Amos, the cries of the captives rose higher than any temple hymn. He warned that the same roads the Philistines had used for profit would soon carry their own ruin. Zephaniah followed a century later, when Assyrian banners already fluttered on the plains. His vision was bleaker, stripped of metaphor. Gaza shall be abandoned, he declared, Ashkelon desolate. Whether his words were prophecy or observation hardly mattered. The destruction had begun. The Philistines' strength, their ports, their fortresses, their fertile valleys, had drawn the empire's hunger. What the prophets called divine judgment, the world called inevitability. Jeremiah, mourning from Jerusalem's edge, took up the same refrain. He saw in the Philistines the mirror of his own people's arrogance. Both nations, he said, had built their confidence on the shifting sands of wealth and alliance. Both would fall beneath the northern armies that rolled like storms through the corridors of the Shephelah. His voice, cracked with sorrow, did not gloat. He spoke as one who knew that history never punishes only one side. To the modern ear, these oracles sound distant, draped in the thunder of theology. But beneath their poetry lies something hauntingly human, the awareness that empires consume themselves from within, that cruelty disguised as order erodes even the mightiest walls. When Amos spoke of the Philistine slave trade, he might as well have been speaking to every generation that turns people into profit. When Jeremiah wept over Ashkelon, he was mourning not a foreign land, but the part of every nation that believes its towers will stand forever. The prophets did not write as historians. They saw the world as moral geography, a landscape of consequence where valleys remembered injustice and winds carried memory. In their eyes, Gaza was not merely a city, it was a wound that refused to close. Ashdod was pride, Ekron greed, Gath forgotten power. Each place became a metaphor for the human condition, for the endless rhythm of ascendancy and decay. Archaeology confirms that by this era, the Philistine cities were changing hands. Assyrian inscriptions record tributes paid by their kings, silver, gold, linen, and oil, to the conquerors from the north. Sargon II besieged Ashdod in 711 before our era, crushing rebellion. A few decades later, Sennacherib marched again, and Ekron's defiance was met with fire. The prophets saw in these campaigns the hand of God. The empires saw logistics and strategy. Between them, the Philistines vanished as a political force, their names surviving only as provinces and memories. And yet, in a strange symmetry, the prophetic vision preserved them more enduringly than archaeology ever could. Each denunciation became a form of remembrance. Even in condemnation, the Philistines were made eternal, as caution, as symbol, as echo. Their story was folded into sacred text, carried forward like driftwood through the centuries, until their ruins turned to dust and their language fell silent. When one reads those prophecies now, it is hard not to hear the undertone of regret. The same land still waits between the hills and the sea. The same valleys still bear the tension of faith and fear. The names have changed, the gods replaced, but the cycle remains. Power rising from trade, consumed by pride, swallowed by consequence. Perhaps the prophets understood this too well. Their words were less prediction than pattern, spoken not once, but forever. As night settles over the ruins of Ashkelon, the sea breathes against its broken walls. Somewhere in the darkness, waves murmur the old names, smoothing them into silence. And you realize, listening, that the prophets were right about one thing above all. The ground remembers. It remembers the weight of cities and the cries of those sold, the arrogance of kings and the brief mercy of wind. It remembers until it is spoken again, and even then, it does not forget. By the 8th century before our time, the 5 cities of the Philistines had already begun to fade from independence into memory. Empires, vast and merciless, were gathering on the horizon. Assyria first, then Babylon, then Persia, each pressing westward like tides of iron. What the prophets called divine correction, history would call the machinery of empire. The Philistines, masters of the coast for centuries, found themselves caught between obedience and obliteration. It began with Assyria's approach. Their kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, marched with armies that measured conquest in kilometers of smoke. To resist was suicide. To submit was slow death by tribute. In 711, before the Common Era, Ashdod rebelled against Assyrian control. Its rulers believed Egypt would come to their aid, but no help arrived. Sargon II descended upon the city with brutal precision. The walls fell, and the survivors were scattered into exile. Ashdod became an Assyrian province, its god, Dagon, silent beneath the new banners. A generation later, Sennacherib punished another uprising at Ekron. Assyrian annals describe prisoners impaled, cities burned, idols carried away. Yet even in submission, fragments of identity remained. Ekron's olive oil presses, once symbols of Philistine prosperity, were expanded under imperial oversight, their output redirected northward to feed the conqueror's cities. The machinery of faith became the machinery of empire. By the early 6th century, Babylon rose from the east like a second eclipse. Where Assyria demanded tribute, Babylon demanded possession. Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns swept across the coast, grinding the Philistine cities into dust. Gaza resisted and was crushed. Ashkelon was razed, its royal family taken captive. Babylonian tablets record the spoils in lists: silver, grain, slaves, gods, catalogues of erasure. In the ruins, life persisted in fragments. Fishermen along the shore, traders in half-built markets, women tending fires among fallen stones. The cities no longer ruled. They endured. Then came Persia, quiet and methodical, inheriting what Babylon had consumed. Under Cyrus and Darius, the region reorganized into satrapies, administrative veins of a greater body. The Philistine cities survived as names, districts, waypoints, supply hubs. Their people, long interwoven with Canaanite and Judean neighbors, spoke new dialects, worshipped under new banners. The line between Philistine and Levantine blurred until it disappeared entirely. To the Persians, they were simply subjects. To history, they were already ghosts. And yet, the sea still touched their ruins. Along the beaches of Ashkelon, the waves broke over the shattered foundations of temples once dedicated to Dagon. Children played among columns that once framed offerings of grain and oil. Traders from distant ports still dropped anchor, exchanging stories of gods that no longer answered. The land moved on, but beneath its surface lingered the echo of 5 hearts, beating faintly through the centuries. By the time the armies of Alexander the Great swept across the region in 332 before our reckoning, the transformation was complete. The Greeks found not Philistines but Hellenized ports, cities speaking the lingua franca of empire. The old faiths were layered over with new myths, the temples rebuilt in marble, the gods renamed. Ashdod became Azotus, Ekron faded into fields, Gath vanished altogether. The Philistine story had dissolved into the larger sea of the Mediterranean world, its people absorbed into the rhythm of conquest and commerce. But disappearance is not death. Traces remain, shards of pottery, buried inscriptions, the faint fingerprints of oil pressed into stone. In these remnants lies the stubborn persistence of identity, even when names are lost. Modern excavations reveal a strange continuity. The same wells used by Assyrians later served Babylonians, then Persians, then Greeks. The layers of earth record not annihilation, but adaptation. The prophets, standing amid this cascade of empires, saw divine justice. Historians see inevitability. Perhaps both are right. The Philistines fell because they were strong in the wrong century, fluent in the language of iron when the world began to speak in empire. Their independence, once their pride, became their vulnerability. They could not imagine a world in which survival meant surrendering the self. And so, when the waves of conquest came, they resisted until even resistance forgot its purpose. Still, there is a strange mercy in their vanishing. To disappear into history is to escape its judgment. The Philistines became the silence between empires, the pause between chapters, the forgotten line in the poem of the Levant. Their cities are ruins, their gods dust, yet their presence lingers in language itself. The word Philistine, reshaped over millennia to mean one who is blind to beauty, unaware of spirit. It is an irony too perfect to ignore. A people who mastered art, trade, and architecture, remembered only as those who could not see. At dusk, when the sea darkens beyond Ashkelon's cliffs, the horizon blurs where sky meets water. The world that consumed the Philistines feels far away, yet its rhythm endures. Empires still rise and crumble. Faith still collides with ambition. Names still change faster than memory. And beneath it all, the same tide whispers to the same shore, carrying the faint echo of a vanished nation. A reminder that what disappears in history often survives in language, and what survives in language never truly dies. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of ruin. Centuries after the Philistine cities fell, the earth began to fold their memory inward, layer by layer, until only fragments remained, ceramic whispers, the shadow of a wall, a name half erased in stone. Archaeologists call these layers strata, but perhaps they are better understood as dreams. Each one a vision of what the world once was, buried beneath the next. To walk among these remains is to move through centuries of forgetting, tracing the slow transformation of a people into myth. In the soil of Ashkelon, pottery shards tell a story of arrival and assimilation. The earliest layers bear the fingerprints of Aegean craft, painted spirals, fish patterns, fine red slip glinting beneath the dust. Above them appear vessels of local design, simpler, sturdier, made for daily use. The change is subtle but profound. The language of art shifting from display to endurance. By the 9th century before our reckoning, the distinct Aegean motifs fade almost entirely, replaced by the plain utility of the Levant. In clay, one can watch identity dissolve. Animal bones too speak in quiet tones. In the earlier settlements, pig remains are abundant, a marker of customs carried from the islands. A few centuries later, they diminish, overtaken by sheep and goat. Diet becomes dialect. Each meal a small negotiation between heritage and belonging. Even the architecture bends to the land. Courtyards expanding to catch desert light. Roofs flattened to hold cool night air. The Philistines were not conquered into extinction. They were absorbed into familiarity, reshaped by proximity and time. Inscriptions recovered from Ekron's ruins trace this linguistic evolution. The earliest are written in a foreign hand, letters sharp and looping, the echo of scripts once carved on Aegean tablets. Later texts adopt the Semitic alphabet, their grammar turning local. A temple inscription naming Achish, son of Padi, king of Ekron, reveals both transformation and persistence. A ruler bearing a Greek name and a Canaanite lineage, bridging two worlds without belonging fully to either. It is in these small contradictions that history lives. Excavations show not a clean break, but a gradual fading, arrival, adaptation, and finally, disappearance under imperial dust. After Assyria's conquest, the material record continues, yet the identity, Philistine, no longer appears. The pottery remains, the houses remain, even the olive presses continue their hum, but the people are now simply inhabitants of the coast. Their distinctness has melted into the broader Levantine Sea, like salt dissolving in water. Modern scientists, turning to DNA, confirm what pottery and language have whispered for decades. In the oldest burials of Ashkelon, genetic traces point towards southern Europe. Perhaps Crete, perhaps Cyprus, the islands that once glimmered with Mycenaean light. A century later, those traces are gone, replaced by the genes of the local population. In less than 4 generations, migration becomes memory. The sea gives and takes, leaving no pure lineage, only continuity disguised as change. And yet, to call this disappearance a loss is to misunderstand history's patience. The Philistines did not vanish. They became the foundation for those who followed. Their craftsmanship lived on in Canaanite pottery. Their trade routes shaped Persian and Greek economies. Their cities remained active through Rome's rise and fall. Each civilization built upon their bones without knowing it. The olive presses of Ekron, the harbours of Gaza, the roads of Ashdod, these are not ruins, they are roots. In every excavation, there is a moment of stillness when the archaeologist's brush uncovers a fragment that defies categorization, a shard too hybrid to label Aegean or Semitic. It is in that moment that the past speaks most clearly. Identity is never fixed. The Philistines teach us that culture is a tide, pulling in one direction today, another tomorrow, yet always returning to the same shore. To the theologian, their fate may seem judgment. To the historian, adaptation. To the dreamer, release. Perhaps the truth is that the Philistines achieved what every civilization eventually must: transformation into the anonymous eternity of humanity. Their cities fell, but the rhythm of their labor continues in every hand that shapes clay. Every trader who measures worth by grain and oil, every wanderer who stands between sea and desert and wonders what it means to belong. At sunset, the ruins of Ekron glow gold beneath the dust. The stones seem to breathe, exhaling centuries of silence. A bird lands upon a fragment of wall and sings, indifferent to the weight of history beneath its feet. In that fleeting song, one might hear what remains of the Philistines. Not a lament, not a warning, but a faint melody of persistence, proof that even forgotten civilizations continue to hum quietly within the living world. To read the story of the Philistines is to practice a double vision, to hold the text and the earth in the same trembling hand. One eye must dwell upon Scripture, where kings and prophets render the coast as a lesson in pride and divine justice. The other must gaze into the soil, where pottery and bones tell of survival, adaptation, and the slow fading of names. Only together do they form a picture that breathes. Each side without the other is incomplete. Faith without evidence becomes myth. Evidence without faith becomes dust. In the sacred writings, the Philistines serve as mirror and shadow. They embody what Israel feared most: prosperity without humility, power without grace. The stories of Samson, Saul, and David cast them as adversaries through whom divine will reveals itself. Each encounter, each battle, each humiliation teaches that human strength, no matter how glittering, bends before the unseen. Yet the scriptures, in their stern poetry, also preserve admiration for their skill in metalwork, their courage in battle, their mastery of the sea. The line between enemy and teacher blurs, as if God himself needed the Philistines to complete his reflection. The archaeologist's eye, however, sees something quieter. Beneath the moral weight of the verses lies a people of immense pragmatism, farmers, merchants, artisans, who navigated the storm of empires with ingenuity. The layers of their cities reveal more coexistence than conquest, more exchange than annihilation. The highlands and the coast were not always at war. Between them flowed trade, marriage, and the shared vulnerability of those who live under the same sun. It is easy to divide history into saints and sinners, but the earth resists such simplicity. It records no good or evil, only the traces of life lived in proximity. From the junction of scripture and soil emerge three quiet truths. The first is that faith, though unseen, thrives most when tested. Israel's encounters with the Philistines forged its identity, not in triumph, but in tension. Without the shadow of the coast, the light of the covenant might have burned too steadily, too sure of itself. The second is that power, however justified, is temporary. The Philistines' iron, Assyria's chariots, Babylon's walls. Each believed itself eternal. Each became dust beneath another's footstep. And the third, the world belongs to those who remember with humility. The prophet spoke this without naming it, that wisdom begins where certainty ends. In every generation, these lessons return disguised in new forms. The valleys of the Shephelah are no longer battlefields, yet the struggle between faith and ambition, humility and pride, continues in quieter ways. The soil still divides and connects. The sea still brings strangers. The stones still whisper of power misplaced. Perhaps that is why the old stories endure, not as history to be mastered, but as mirrors to be faced. When one reads the Bible today, to look with both eyes is an act of reverence. With one, you see the moral architecture of a people learning to survive under divine gaze. With the other, you see the human architecture of survival itself. Between them stretches a fragile bridge built of imagination, patience, and awe. Across it walks every seeker who wishes to see the past not as judgment, but as dialogue. For the believer, the Philistines reveal that God's justice is woven through history's fabric, subtle and exact. For the skeptic, they prove that no culture is immune to the gravity of time. For both, they whisper the same secret. Meaning endures not in monuments, but in the capacity to listen, to text, to stone, to silence. As dusk drifts once more over the coastal plain, the 5 cities sink again into shadow. The same hills watch over them, unchanging, unconcerned. Somewhere in the distance, waves roll toward the shore with the patience of eternity. The story of the Philistines is neither triumph nor tragedy. It is the slow exhalation of a truth older than any nation, that all things made by hands will fade, but the questions they raise will remain, waiting in the dark for eyes willing to open. In the end, what remains of the Philistines is not ruin but resonance. Their story drifts like salt through the wind, invisible yet ever present, mingling with the breath of the land they once claimed. The cities are gone. Gath buried under centuries of dust. Ashkelon broken by the tides. Ekron silent except for the hum of bees. But the memory persists in the rhythm of the earth itself. To stand upon that coast at dusk is to feel a pulse beneath the sand, faint but insistent, as though the land itself were dreaming of the people who first taught it, the language of iron and ambition. They came from the sea, they say, and to the sea they returned. What began as migration ended as mythology, a cycle that repeats with every civilization that rises from the edge of survival. The Philistines are no longer a people to be found, but an idea that lingers, the idea that strength and artistry, faith and arrogance, are threads too easily knotted together. They remind us that greatness is not measured in walls or weapons, but in the grace to recognize when the tide is turning. The 5 cities that once gleamed along the coast are now coordinates on maps, their names shifting through languages like dreams retold. Yet if one listens in the right silence, their voices remain. A merchant's laughter in the surf, a priest's chant carried on wind, a child's cry swallowed by distance. Time has stripped them of form, but not of presence. They have become part of the landscape, inseparable from the fields and stones that outlived them. Historians close their books at the point of dissolution, but the story does not end there. Beneath every ruin lies continuity, the potter's hand in a later craftsman, the melody of an old hymn in a modern tongue, the same gesture of faith as oil is poured upon an altar. What vanishes in name survives in motion. The Philistines, for all their disappearance, remain in the way human beings persist, in adaptation, in inheritance, in the quiet refusal of memory to die completely. Their disappearance under empire was not annihilation, but transformation, a merging into the larger body of humanity. Perhaps this is the true victory no conqueror can claim, to become the unseen foundation of those who follow, to live on not as empire, but as influence. The olive presses of Ekron, the iron of Gath, the markets of Gaza, each became part of the world's bloodstream, indistinguishable yet essential. In forgetting them, we have absorbed them. And so, the question lingers. Why does their shadow still move through the pages of Scripture, through the dreams of archaeologists, through the whispers of the sea? Perhaps because they stand as a mirror, reflecting the fragile balance between creation and destruction, belief and doubt, permanence and decay. Their fall teaches what their life once hid. That civilization itself is a kind of prayer, uttered against the inevitability of silence. Night descends upon the Shephelah. The horizon bleeds its last colour into the sea. The 5 cities, unseen but not absent, rest beneath the sand like embers waiting for a wind that will never come. And there, between the waves and the hills, you can almost hear it, the slow heartbeat of a world that remembers, not a warning, not a lament, only the soft, endless rhythm of the past exhaling through the present, reminding us that every ending is simply the beginning of forgetting, and that even forgetting has its own kind of grace. The wind moves softly now across the sleeping coast. The stars above Ashkelon flicker like distant embers, and the sea, forever patient, folds itself over the ruins without a sound. The valleys of the Shephelah are dark again, the outlines of old roads hidden beneath the wild grass. 5 cities, once fierce, once proud, now rest beneath the same silence they once defied. You breathe with the land. The night tastes of salt and dust, of endings and endurance. Somewhere in that hush, Scripture and history merge into one long sigh. Indistinguishable, there are no lessons left to claim, no victories to count, only the echo of time returning to itself. If you listen closely, you might hear a faint rhythm, the whisper of waves against forgotten walls, the heartbeat of soil remembering what the world has chosen to forget. It is neither sorrow nor peace, but something deeper, the stillness that comes when all stories finally rest. Let the darkness close gently. Let the names fade. The coast, the hills, the sky, each holds its own quiet prayer. And as sleep begins to gather, imagine the 5 cities glowing faintly beneath the earth, not as ruins, but as memories breathing in unison with the tide. Nothing is truly gone. Everything becomes silence, and in silence, everything begins again.